What you guys can see on this footage right here is not an everyday ant colony. On the one hand, because they have a bitter past, surrounded by catastrophic disasters, and on the other hand, because they belong to a very rare species held by only a handful of people. In this video, we discovered their story, which, unfortunately, is a story poisoned by mass death. If you are interested in ant keeping and you want to learn from other people's mistakes, stay with us until the very end, because in the meantime I'll try to explain the ways you can avoid the decline of your colonies and prevent the horror of getting your ants deadly dehydrated. Hey, subscribe if you want to see more of these videos. Welcome to the Pet Ant Tales channel. This thriving Camponotus nylanderi colony has a rather troubled story. Poor things had such a hard past that it's even bad to think about it, what hardships they went through until they got to me. Although I don't know much about their origin, one thing is for sure. On a winter day in 2018, I sacrificed all my spare money to save them from complete extinction. Unfortunately, there aren't many photos from that time, but they were in a truly horrific state when I got them. I can only assume the Queen's age, but I think it could have been about 6 or 8 years ago since she flew out. Yes, you're right, that's a high number in an ant's life, but rest assured that for Camponotus queens, it's also not rare to live for 10-15 years, so it's almost sure that you will see more videos about them later on. More experienced ant keepers might have noticed by now that any ant colony older than 6 years should be much bigger than this, and that's absolutely true. Since this is a very rare species within the ant keepers community, the seller asked for a hefty price for these beauties, even though it was uncertain that they will survive the upcoming winter. Now it's 2021 and these recordings were done only a few days ago, so luckily they are alive and happy. I surely could have kept them in a better condition, but I will go into more detail about this later on. But before that, I'll let you know how I came across the situation and what happened to them since then. I bought this colony only a few weeks after that I sent my first masses to their cozy winter resting place. In an international Facebook group, I found a desperate post from a person who explained in a few lines what kind of colony he'd like to sell in England, which was only about a 2 hours drive from me at the time, by the way. However, you should know that this goes against Facebook's policy that forbids selling live animals through the platform, but let's say I gave a helping hand to someone. Plus, later on, we used other communication platforms to fulfill the business. I can't remember how he put it, but I'm sure he asked for help due to family emergency. Later, it turned out that he had this exceptionally rare Camponotus nylanderi species, whose queen he acquired from a Spanish friend. According to him, there were already more than 100 ants when that particular family emergency happened. In a nutshell, he wasn't able to look after them anymore, and unfortunately he didn't see them for a long time, because our little survivors stayed at the ex-wife's house. We agreed on a price that included the nest and an outward. We met the same evening. It was dark, and because the business was done on the street, I didn't ask questions, just made sure there's some life in that little cardboard box, Then I paid and drove home with my aunt. In the box, by the way, there was a gas beton nest, a plastic outward, and some connecting pipes. At home, I was shocked when I took a closer look at the nest, and I noticed all the dead bodies. Believe me or not, there were more dead ants than alive ones in there. I couldn't see any larvae and only a handful of workers. As it turned out, these ants were left alone for weeks without any water in the Etong nest, which is known for its porous structure and the inability of keeping moisture for a long time. It became pretty obvious that almost all the 100 dead workers fell victim to dehydration. They arrived in a nest very similar to this, with about double of the inner capacity. The once busy chambers, filled with a diligent Camponotus family, became a place of decay and, eventually, their own graveyard. Here I'd like to note to all who keep their ants in a porous, aerated gas beton nest, please pay attention to regular moisturizing to avoid similar troubles. Needless to say, how horrible it was to see a once thriving dynasty simply becoming a shelter for a few survivors. So I urgently had to do something. Since they were stuck in the nest for weeks now, I thought they could wait for a few more minutes, so I started to clean up the outward area. Then I carefully placed the top plexiglass into an empty container. Inside the nest, panic burst out immediately, and most of the ants started to escape to the empty container before I could even finish my cleaning. After this, with a soft bristle brush, I collected all the survivors one by one and carefully placed them back into the clean and moisture enclosure. Almost immediately, they found the wet cotton wool sticking out of the test tube and the prepared honey. It was a great pleasure to see that they were finally in a good place. Minutes later, they started to take care of their queen. In the meantime, I also tried to clean the moldy and dried remains from the Etong nest. There were dead ants in almost every chamber. About 20 of them remained in total, and at that point I noticed that there were still some eggs and larvae that had been profusely hidden from me. After cleaning, I put the nest back in place and opened up their freshly moistened home, which might not have been pretty, but free of corpses and fungus. Then they took their temporary place on the shelf. I carefully covered them, and for days I tried not to disturb the colony that had danced back from the brink of death. Later, honey, fresh insects and water were of course always placed in the enclosure. In the first period, their explorers went out to search relatively often, but then after a couple of weeks, the activity stopped. Well, I thought I'd have a look, so I took the blackout off the nest somewhere in the first half of the third week. I was pleased to see that individuals with nicely rounded bellies were resting in almost every corner, somewhat further from each other. In the Queen's Lodge, there were rows of minions ready to carry out Her Majesty's every command. So the dynasty ate properly and gathered the energy to start again. Since we were in the middle of the winter, they also had to hibernate to some extent, but considering that they came from a warmer climate than ours, they were given a cool but not too cold corner to rest. In this corner, disconnected from the outside world, they awaited March with stable moisture levels. By then, I ordered a new, large-sized nest from China, because I hoped, given that it was already a middle-aged colony, they would multiply nicely by the end of the summer. Unfortunately, this was not the case, and this led me to make this video. They've been living in this clay nest for a little more than 2 years now, but unfortunately, they could not even occupy a quarter of it. This is definitely my fault, since I could have expected that they would not recover from a near extinction shock in a few months. But at least it was good that I can now report to you what should not be done with small or medium-sized colonies. As you can see, the extra space in the nest made more harm than help. After the first couple of insects were brought in, I started to suspect that they would leave their waste inside, but I never thought that at least half of the chambers would be filled with garbage. Anyway, this nest seemed like a great solution at first glance, but unfortunately, I was wrong. It has some advantages over other nests, like you can see them from all sides, or that you only need to moisten it in the middle, and if you keep it in an even temperature area, it will stay wet inside for a long time, but it is probably one of the worst choices for early colonies. As it can be seen from the example, simply because these nests are giant labyrinths and colonies with less than 200-300 individuals are simply unable to keep them tidy, and they technically get lost in them. For weeks, I tried to lure them to another, significantly smaller, much more suitable nest using different methods, but no luck. All I managed to achieve was that I disturbed them more times during this period, in these 3 weeks, than I did ever before altogether. Therefore, when I finally started this video, I decided to move them by hand to where I hope they will have a much better chance of a population explosion than in this unpleasantly dirty maze. Until the next video, take care of yourselves and your beloved pets. Bye!